I'm like you, whenever I buy a new camera, all I want to do is to take it out of the box and start shooting with it. However, for whatever reason, Fujifilm decided to completely revamp the ergonomics of the X-H2s compared to the previous generations of X-series cameras. So with all your familiar dials now gone, if you don't want to have to jump again and again in the menus of the camera to adjust your settings, there is no choice. You need to set up your C1, C2, C3 and so on custom settings. Now I know that's not what you want to do at first, but trust me, this will be worth it. And it's not that complicated, especially as in this video, I'm going to show you how to do just that. A failure to plan is a plan to fail. So before you start dabbling with the settings and menus, I highly recommend that you make a map of what you are planning to use each custom setting for. Here is the map I made for myself. In this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to set up the camera this way. All you will need to do is to adjust each setting to match your own preferences. So let's get started. If you are like me, you are probably expecting the custom settings to be somewhere in the setup menu, maybe in the user setting menu right here, or maybe in the button dial setting menu right here. But it's actually not there. It's a little bit hidden, so don't ask me why. You know, we don't do these things because they're easy, but because they are hard, right? So if you want to find the custom settings submenus, you have to go in the image quality setting, and you're going to scroll down up to page 3 of the image quality setting, and you're going to find something called the edit save custom setting, and that's where we're going to define all our C1, C2 and so on custom settings. Now, before we dive into those, I recommend that you update the setting just below, so auto update custom setting. By default, this is set to enable, but I recommend you change that to disable, and I will explain you why a little bit later. Now, the other thing that we probably need to change right off the bat is just below in the custom mode setting. So if you go there, you will see all your C1, C2 up to C7 setting, and that's where you assign whether one of these custom settings is a photo mode or whether it is a video mode. So if you remember, for me, the map that I have made, I want my custom 4 and my custom 5 to be movie mode, so I'm going to change that right now before going even further into the submenus. Okay, so once we're here, we're going to go into the edit save custom setting, and that's where we are going to do most of the customization that we want to do and set up. So we're gonna start with custom 1. So if you remember custom 1, I want to make it auto bracketing setting, okay? And I want to do 5 frames, and I want to have steps of 2 stops between each of the frames. Okay, so let's jump into custom 1. We're gonna go into edit check. Okay, we're gonna go there. All right, so usually if I do some exposure bracketing, I usually like to shoot in aperture priority. So I'm going to change this program mode into aperture priority. Now you will see that this value that I have changed now has a red dot right next to it. And you see this because we have set the auto update to disabled. Okay, and what that means is that every value that has a red dot is a value that has been manually amended, but that has not been saved yet. Okay, so because now we are setting up our custom setting, I want to save every of the amendment I'm going to do right now. So every time I'm going to change something, there will be a red dot next to this setting, and I'm going to press the Q button to save the value that I have set. Okay. If I wanted, I could set my aperture right here. I don't really have any preference, to be honest, for my auto bracketing, but I'm just gonna go with the brightest aperture setting for the lens, and I'm just going to leave it like that. And where I'm going to actually change something is in the drive mode. Okay, by default this is a single picture, but I want to change that into bracketing. Okay, so I'm going to go down and I'm going to select exposure bracketing. If you want you can select different type of bracketing, but the one I want is exposure bracketing. Okay, because I've changed this value, once again, there's a red dot next to it. So I'm going to press the Q button to save this change. Okay, so that's the very basic settings for my custom one, but I can actually customize everything else. Okay, so that's what I'm gonna do now. I'm going to go into each of the menus of the camera and I'm going to change everything that needs to be changed. All right, so image size is fine. However, the image quality, so by default, the camera assume you're going to be shooting in JPEG. So I don't want that. I want to shoot in RAW plus JPEG. So I'm going to change that and I'm going to press Q to save it. The RAW recording, I want it to be lossless compressed. I'm going to press Q to save it. And I'm going to shoot my JPEG or HEIF additional image on top of the RAW. I'm going to select HEIF. All right, I'm going to save that. Film simulation, I'm happy with standard. I don't want to add any grain on this setting. I'm happy with all of this. I'm going to go down until I find something that I want to change. So nothing there. I'm switching now to the autofocus mode. Same thing. So for my bracketing setting, usually autofocus in single mode is fine. However, I don't want it to be in all. I want it to be in single point. So I'm going to change that. I don't need to go into the autofocus continuous setting because I've set it to single. Okay, so I'm going to continue. I don't need any eye detect because usually I'm going to use that for landscape. Same thing for subject detection. I don't need to change that. On the other hand, I need to change the manual focus assist. So I'm going to change that to peaking with red in the high setting. All right, I'm going to press Q to save it. And I'm going to continue. I'm just going to go through each of the menus until I see something that I want to change. Okay, so now I'm in the camera settings. I'm continuing. I don't see anything I want to change here. Okay, here I am in the exposure bracketing setting. So because I'm customizing exposure bracketing C1 dial, this is where I really need to dig into. Okay, so what I said is that instead of the 3 frames by default for exposure bracketing, I want to have 5 frames, okay? And instead of having a third of a stop increment, which is really not enough, I'm gonna change that to 2 steps, okay? So now when I do my exposure bracketing, the camera is going to take 5 pictures and each picture will be separated by 2 stops of exposure. The other thing I like to change is the sequence setting. I like to go from the darkest image to the brightest image. When you download your image into your photo library, it makes it very easy basically to recognize whenever you have a set of bracketed shots. Okay, so I'm going to select this and I'm going to press Q to save it. All right. I'm going to continue, see if there's anything I want to change. So image stabilization mode, I don't like continuous, I like shooting only, so I'm going to change that, press Q to save it, and I'm going to continue. Auto ISO, I want to change this. I don't want to go up to 12,800, I want to limit to 6,400. Okay, so one more setting that I change, press Q, and I'm going to continue. No flash, this is not a video mode, so I don't need to change anything here. I don't want to change anything in the sound setup. So I'm basically now done. I have selected every menus and sub-menus that I want to be saved for my custom one. All right, so custom one is now ready. The last thing I'm gonna do is I'm going to give it a name. Okay, so I'm going to call it bracket 5 image to stop so that I can remember now that my C1 setting is my bracketing setting. All right, let's move on to custom 2. So same thing, custom 2 is going to be a photo mode. However, I want it to be not a bracketing mode. I want it to be a continuous high mode with phase detect enabled. So same thing, I like to shoot my pictures in aperture priority. Okay, press Q to save this setting. I want the aperture to be the brightest as possible, so I'm going to leave this value right here. However, I don't want a single shot, I want continuous high. By default, the camera selects mechanical shutter, that's why I can only choose between 10 and 15, but if I amend the setting to electronic shutter, I will be able to change my burst speed to 30 or 40 images if I want, but in my case I like to shoot in with the mechanical shutter, so 15 frames per second is fine. Okay, going to press Q to save. All right, so these are the basic information of my custom 2 settings, but similarly to my C1 setting, I'm going to go through each of the menus and I'm going to amend the values to match my preferences. So once again, I want to shoot in RAW plus JPEG. I want to be in lossless compressed. Again, I'm going to select HEIF. Now you can see I forgot to press Q for the RAW recording setting. So I just go back, press Q, and so on. So film simulation, I don't need to change that. I don't want to change anything here. I'm going to continue. I'm just checking every menu. In the autofocus, I don't want to be in single focus. I want to be in continuous autofocus. I'm going to change that. Autofocus mode, I just want to be in a zone actually. I need to change that. And my autofocus setting, let's go into something customized and let's have a look. Tracking sensitivity, I want actually to lock onto my subject, and I want to be able to react if the subject change speed, but you know, I'm gonna be shooting human beings, so the speed tracking sensitive doesn't need to be that high. Okay, so I'm going to go like that, going to press Q to save it. I'm going to continue. And this is where I can set my C2 custom mode to automatically have face detection on. So I'm going to do that. iAuto is fine. Go back. Now I have a red dot because I changed this setting. Going to press Q to save it. In case I ever have to do some manual focus, what I mean C2, probably I'm not going to use it, but I'm going to select some focus picking nonetheless, just in case. Okay, and I'm going to continue. And here is something that I didn't change for C1, but that I want to change for my C2. Because I will be shooting in burst, I want to tell the camera to actually prioritize focus. Okay, so I will have less images. I want to always have like 15 images per second, but I'm going to maximize the number of these images that will be actually in focus. So I prefer to have less images and all of them in focus rather than have more images and a bunch of them actually blurry. So okay, let's do that. Let's continue. I don't want to change anything here. This time I don't need to put anything in bracketing because this is not going to be a bracket mode. So shutter type, this is where I could potentially select electronic shutter if I wanted to have a burst mode that is equal to 30 frames per second or 40 frames per second, but personally I like mechanical, so I'm happy with that. IS mode, again, I prefer shooting only, so I'm going to change that. Press Q to save it. And then the ISO, this time I'm going to change again the max sensitivity, but I'm going to also change the shutter speed. I don't want it to be in auto. I want to freeze a human being subject who is probably not going to be running very fast, but I'm going to select 1/125th of a second. Okay, going to go back, press Q to save this setting, and nothing else to change here. My custom 2 setting is ready. I'm going to go back. The last thing I need to change is to give it a custom name. All right, so I'm going to call it continuous high people so that I remember this is going to be a burst mode and the eye autofocus is selected by default. Now my custom 3 setting, if you remember, I want it to be continuous high, but with subject detection rather than with eye autofocus. Okay, so all the settings of custom 3 are actually going to be very close to the settings of C2. So rather than going into custom 3 and change everything the same way I've done it for C2, here is a little tip. I'm just going to copy everything I have in C2 and save it into custom 3. Okay, so now my custom 3 is 100% equal to my custom 2. I can now go into the details and change the very few settings that will differentiate my C2 and my C3. Okay, so here I don't need to change anything, but if I go here in the settings, I'm going to look for subject detection in the autofocus mode. The other thing I'm going to change is for the autofocus mode, I'm going to select wide tracking, okay, in case my subject is like going through the frame from one side to the other. You know, you're facing like a cat or a bird, and the bird decides to take off. I want to be able to capture that, so I'm going to change the autofocus mode, and I'm going to continue until I find eye autofocus. This time it needs to be turned off, and instead I'm going to turn on the subject detection. Now I'm hesitating between animal and bird, but I think I'm going to select bird, and I might change it maybe later on if I end up not shooting that many birds, but this is what I'm going to select here. There's another thing I want to change. So release focus priority, again, I will keep focus, so I'm not going to change that, but the one thing I want to change is the auto ISO, because this time I'm going to be photographing subjects that move much faster. I'm going to select the fastest shutter speed you can select here, which is 1/500. All right, so I'm going to change that. I'm going to press Q to save this, and once I've done this, I'm basically done for C2. All right. The last thing that I need to change is the name, so let's do that. Okay, so I'm going to call it continuous high bird because I selected bird as my default subject for the subject detection setting. Okay, so now that I have my C1, C2, C3, which are the 3 custom settings I wanted to set up in photo mode, let's jump into the video modes. Okay, so if you remember, my C4 is going to be 6.2K at 24 frames per second, and my C5 is going to be slow motion in 4K. Okay, so here is a problem. You can see that C1, C2, C3, and C6 and C7 have been assigned to a photo mode, but you don't see C4 and C5 assigned to anything. If you remember earlier, we changed it to being assigned to video mode. But right now, I have the mode dial of the camera set on aperture priority, and that's a photo mode. Because it's a photo mode, if I jump into the custom setting right now, and I go into edit check, all the menus that I see now in my C4, even though I told the camera C4 is going to be a movie mode, these are related to photo. Okay, so this is really definitely not good. So I can't go into my custom 4 setting right now. What I need to do first is I need to change the mode of the camera to something related to movie. So if I select the movie mode here, and now I go back into the menus, you can see that the edit, save, custom setting menu that we have been using so far is now not in the image quality menu anymore. It's not here. It's in this movie setting menu. Okay, so it's another thing that is different between photo modes and video mode. Okay, so let's just go into this. You can see you have exactly the same menus, they're just in a different place. So let's go into edit, save, custom setting. And now you can see that my C4 and C5 settings have been assigned to movie mode. So let's go into C4. I'm gonna go into edit check. When I'm shooting video, I like to shoot in manual mode. Okay, I'm going to press Q. I'm going to select the shutter speed and I want to shoot in 24 frames per second. So that means I want a shutter speed of 1/48 of a second. But if you see, right now, I cannot find 1/48 of a second. And that's because I have not set the frame rate that I want for my C4 yet. So I'm basically trying to select a shutter speed that is actually linked to what is the default frame rate for the system. So if I go now into the menu, the first thing that I actually need to change before I can change this shutter speed is the frame rate of the movie I'm trying to record. So as I said, I want to shoot in 6.2K in open gate and I want to select 24 frames per second. So now that I've done that, I'm going to press Q to save it. And if I go back to my basic settings and I go back into the shutter speed, I can now select 1/48 of a second because I've changed the frame rate of the movie I am trying to record. So I'm going to save that. And similarly to my C1, C2, C3 setting, I'm going to go through all of the settings one by one, and everything that I want to change, I'm going to change it. So this is basically telling me that I'm recording with a film simulation. I don't want that. I'm going to record in F-log. So let's change that. Let me continue. IBIS mode, I'm happy with IBIS selected. However, I do want the boost mode to be on, so I'm going to change that. I want to shoot in auto ISO, so that's fine. However, I do want to have some zebras, depending on where you are. And I want the zebras to be at like 90%, okay. Let's continue. I am going to use movie optimized control. Okay, and I want the tally light to be both in the front and in the back. Okay, let's continue. I don't want to change anything here. Nothing here. Focus mode in continuous is fine, but I do want to select the area, so I'm going to do like that. And I want to lock the subject on which I am recording. So I'm going all the way to the right to make sure that the camera doesn't focus on something and then find something else to focus. So I'm telling the camera in this mode, once I'm focusing on something, just keep focusing on the same thing, okay? And then the autofocus speed, I'm going to leave the default one in that case. I'm going to save that. I'm going to select IAF because I'm probably going to be recording myself with this mode, so let's do that. If I ever need to use a manual focus, I'm going to use again focus peaking red high, so save that. I'm going to continue. Is there anything I want to change here? I'm going to change the mic to auto level, both for the internal and external mic. And I'm just going through and checking if there's anything I want to change here. No, all right. So now that I've done all of this, my C4 setting is ready. So the last thing I need to do is to give it a custom name. Okay, so I will be shooting in 6.2K at 24 frames per second. So here is my C4. Now I'm going to use the same trick that we did between C2 and C3 earlier, rather than going through all the settings that I want for video, because there's a lot of them that will be in common. So for example, I want to use movie optimized control, I want to use zebras and so on. So what I'm gonna do is I'm going to copy the C4 settings and I will apply them to C5, okay? So here we go. Now that I have this as a base, if I go into C5, I also want to shoot in manual mode. However, I will be shooting in slow motion, so I need a faster shutter speed. So we're going to be shooting in 120 frames per second. So I'm going to select 1/240th of a second. Here we go. And I'm going to go through all the different menus here. So I don't need to change movie mode, but it's going to change automatically basically when I select that I want to shoot in slow motion, okay? And I'm going to select 4K at 120 frames per second with a rendering in the camera into 24 frames per second, okay? So I'm going to save that. And again, because I have copy-pasted the settings of C4, I don't need to change the rest, okay? I am using F-Log. I am using the IS mode. However, when I'm going to be shooting these, I do not want the boost to be on. So let's do that. I'm happy with auto ISO, the zebras, movie optimized control, that's fine. Tally lights, that's fine. Let's continue. I'm just checking if there's anything I want to change. Probably that's fine. Do I want to change the tracking sensitivity here? Probably not, so I'm going to leave it for now. On the other end, I do not want to have this on. However, I might be finding animals and I want to be able to shoot them very quickly, getting into C5 slow motion if I see a bird, for example. So I'm going to do that. Select subject detection setting with bird. I'm going to continue. Is there anything else I want to change here? No, this is fine. This is fine. Okay. All right. So my C5 setting is now ready. The last thing I need to change is to give it a custom name. Okay, so with C5, I will be shooting in 4K at 120 frames per second. All right. So let's go back. So now I have my C4 and C5 movie modes customized. All right. Now, let's see how all of this work. Let's go back into shooting mode and let me select, for example, C1, okay? So if you remember C1 is a photo mode and it's a bracketing mode. And you can see that I have my exposure bracketing that is being recalled because I selected C1, and you can see that the bracket will have 5 images and each of the image is separated by 2 stops. Now, same thing, if I go into C2, I am now in continuous high and I have eye detect selected. C3, I'm still in continuous high, but this time I have bird detection selected for the autofocus. So these were for my photo modes. And so now if I go into C4, you will see we're gonna switch from a photo mode to a video mode. All right, so we are now recording in F-Log and we are at 20 frames per second in 6.2K. All right, I have eye detect selected and my shutter speed is 1/40th of a second. So by default, I just do a switch to C4 and I'm ready to shoot in 6K. And now if I go into C5, my shutter speed has been automatically changed to 1/240th per second. So I am ready to shoot in 4K at 120 frames per second. All right, so one other thing that I want to show you is, so let's say, for example, we go back into C1 right here. All right, so now I'm in C1. I am in auto exposure bracketing. And let's say I want to turn on IAF, okay? So I just turned on IAF, okay? Now, let's say I also want to input some exposure compensation, so I'm going to do that. And I've inputted a -2 exposure compensation, all right? And let's say that, suddenly I need to shoot something in C2 mode, so I switch to C2. Okay, so look at what happened. Look at what happens when I switch back into C1. So now that I switch back into C1, you can see that the camera remembers that I turned on IAF and I inputted a -2 exposure compensation, okay? I go back to C2, the exposure compensation is gone. I go back into C1, the exposure compensation is back. And this is the reason why earlier I told you to disable the auto update, because if you didn't disable the auto update, Now the camera would remember forever that you want to have a -2 exposure compensation when you are in C1. Well, it is most likely that the next time you take your camera, let's say on a different day, you want your C1 setting to be a good and clean starting point, okay? You don't want to be bothered by the fact that the last time you used it, you needed to use a -2 exposure compensation. So look at what happens. Let's say I turn off the camera now, and let's imagine we are the next day. So next day, I could totally forgot about this -2 exposure compensation. I totally forgot about the IAF that I turned on for my C1. If I turn the camera back on now, so I'm in C1 and the camera has reset the C1 to the values we actually saved manually one by one earlier. So the exposure compensation is gone and the IAF is gone, right? So this is the reason why, in my opinion, you want to disable the auto update so that your starting point every time you take the camera is as expected and you are not being polluted by whatever amendments you've done on the fly during your previous shoot. Now that I have set up my C1 to C5 custom modes, I can finally take the camera and go out and shoot. I am actually shooting this last clip using my C4 video custom mode. So I am in 6.2K at 24 frames per second. I have the eye detect autofocus on. It's actually working very well. I have no doubt that I am in focus. That's one of the great points of the X-H2s. But anyway, more on that probably in the next video. In the meantime, if you have any questions regarding this tutorial, just leave them in the comments section down below and I will do my best to answer them. If you are not subscribed yet, don't forget to click the subscribe button and I will see you in the next video. Take care, everyone.